Good morning, my friends and fellow students. Today we're going to be looking at Lesson 4 from A Course in Miracles. And before we jump in, I did a little preparation, and there were certain ideas and concepts I thought would be worth reflecting on before we read this together. Okay, first of all, the Course states that this is a major exercise. So that's kind of exciting. And it will be different than the preceding ones, the first 3 lessons in practice. Okay, this time the exercises will not begin with the idea for today. Okay. Also, they gave in the reading of the lesson insight into what the aim or the goal of the lesson is. And I always feel that it's good to reflect on an aim or goal, like to know where we're going at the beginning of a lesson. Okay, so the aim here is to train you in the first steps toward the goal of separating the meaningless from the meaningful. The aim here is to train you in the first steps towards the goal of separating the meaningless from the meaningful. Okay, so it's pretty exciting. We're embarking today on an exercise that is considered to be a major exercise. All right, so here we go. All right, lesson 4. These thoughts, our thoughts, do not mean anything. They are like the things we see in this room, on this street, from this window, in this place. Whatever your perspective is, that's how I look at what the Course is trying to say here. The first time I read it, I thought it was sounding a little redundant, and in Lesson 1 they said it that way, Lesson 2, Lesson 3, and now Lesson 4. And I think it's just so precise that it wants to capture, whatever your perspective is, however you see it. So these thoughts do not mean anything. They're like the thoughts I see in this room, on the street, from this window, in this place. Unlike the preceding ones, these exercises do not begin with the idea for today. In these practice periods, begin with noting the thoughts that are crossing your mind for about a minute. Then apply the idea to them. If you are already aware of unhappy thoughts, use them as subjects for the idea. Do not, however, select any thoughts that you think are bad. You will find, if you train yourself to look at your thoughts, that they represent such a mixture. In a sense, none of them can be called good or bad. That is why they do not mean anything. In selecting the subjects for the application of today's idea, the usual specificity is required. Do not be afraid to use good thoughts as well as bad. None of them represent your real thoughts, which are being covered up by them. The good ones are but shadows of what lies beyond, and shadows make sight difficult. The bad ones are blocks to sight and make seeing impossible. You do not want either. This is a major exercise and will be repeated from time to time in somewhat different form. The aim here is to train you in the first steps toward the goal of separating the meaningless from the meaningful. It is the first attempt in the long-range purpose of learning to see the meaningless as outside you and the meaningful within. It is also the beginning of training your mind to see, to recognize what is the same and what is different. In using your thoughts for application of the idea for today, identify each thought by the central figure or event it contains. For example, this thought about blank does not mean anything. It is like the things I see in this room, on this street, and so on. Whatever your perspective is, wherever you're seeing from. You can also use the idea for a particular thought that you recognize as harmful. This practice is useful, but it is not a substitute for the more random procedures to be followed for the exercise, of just including the good and the bad, and understanding that they're all meaningless. Do not, however, examine your mind for more than a minute or so. I think that was a Freudian slip. You are too inexperienced as yet to avoid the tendency to become pointlessly preoccupied. Further, since these exercises are the first of their kind, you may find the suspension of judgment in connection with the thoughts particularly difficult. Do not repeat these exercises more than 3 or 4 times during the day. We will return to them later in the workbook. Okay, so just a recap. The aim of lesson 4, to train you in the first steps toward the goal of separating the meaningless from the meaningful. Okay? And how are you going to go about this practice? We're going to begin by noting the thoughts that are crossing our mind for about a minute. So just sit quietly for about a minute and let the thoughts randomly float and pass through the screen of your mind. Okay? Randomly. The good, the bad. Okay? And as these thoughts are reflected on, you're going to read and apply the idea to them. The idea for the day. These thoughts do not mean anything. They are like the things I see in this room, on the street, from this window, in this place. Let all ideas float through. Thoughts you consider good or bad, let go. None of them represent your real thoughts, which are being covered up by them. And then lastly, try to identify a central figure or theme of a particular thought and say, this thought about my health does not mean anything. It is like the things I see in this room. This thought about my job does not mean anything. It is like the things I see in this room. My thoughts about my guitar does not mean anything. It is like the things I see in this room. My thoughts about comedy clubs do not mean anything. It is like the things I see in this room. The good, the bad, it's all the same. These thoughts are meaningless. Okay, repeat this idea 3 or 4 times today. Okay. God bless. Thank you for joining me.